My name is Thomas Barlow. I am 48 years old, living in the quiet northern suburbs of Seattle, and I am a divorced father to Lydia, my 15-year-old daughter. Lydia visits me every other weekend. On the surface, my life looks stable. A solid job, a modest three-bedroom house, and a steady income. But beneath that polished veneer lies 7 years of relentless, exhausting labor. 7 years of missed family dinners, skipped school plays, and weekends spent in the dark, answering emergency system alerts while the rest of the world enjoyed their lives. I was the director of systems architecture at Vanguard Infrastructure Partners. If a major client's cloud platform crashes at 3 in the morning, I am the one they call to diagnose the failure and implement a fix before the client's executive team even realizes there is a problem. I joined Vanguard right after my divorce. Lydia was only 8 years old, and I desperately needed a steady income, reliable health insurance, and proof that I could still provide a stable life. Vanguard needed someone with experience, someone who could remain calm under pressure and adapt to a changing technological landscape. I possessed all of those qualifications, and one more thing that made me vulnerable. I was willing to sacrifice my personal life to prove my worth. For 7 years, I never once said no. I rebuilt data infrastructures, managed furious corporate clients after botched software deployments, and trained every junior engineer who walked through our doors. Once, I had to cancel Lydia's 13th birthday dinner because a critical healthcare database went offline. She told me she understood, but the disappointed look in her eyes haunted me for weeks. I constantly reassured myself that the sacrifice would be worth it. I believed that the extra hours, the unpaid overtime, and the invisible fixes would eventually be recognized. 18 months ago, when our veteran chief technology officer, Raymond Caldwell, announced his retirement, our chief executive officer, Victor Halloway, called me into his office. Victor was 61, known for his polished demeanor and sharp suits. He looked me in the eye and told me that my work had been exceptional and that the board was supportive of me succeeding Raymond. I respected Victor. He had a reputation for building companies where competence mattered far more than personal connections. For the first time in a decade, I felt like my sacrifices were going to be rewarded. Victor asked me to keep the news quiet for the time being, so I did. I did not even tell Lydia. I simply worked harder, sharpening my skills and preparing myself for the massive responsibility. Weeks slowly turned into months. I was invited into executive strategy sessions, leading system overhauls instead of just implementing them. Department heads praised my insights, and I allowed myself to believe my career was finally reaching its peak. I remember the morning of the announcement as if it were happening right now. The executive boardroom was filled with senior managers, board members, and department heads. Everyone expected Victor to officially name Raymond Caldwell's successor, and the consensus was that the role belonged to me. Victor gave me a small, reassuring nod from the head of the table. I straightened my tie, took a deep breath, and waited. I had no idea that everything I believed about corporate fairness, hard work, and loyalty was about to be shattered. Back then, I still believed that if you gave your life to a company, they would reward you in return. But the corporate world does not operate on loyalty or merit. Sometimes, just as you are preparing to step up to the platform you built, the people at the top will quietly pull the floor out from under your feet, leaving you to fall into the dark. The conference room that morning was heavy with anticipation, the air thick and stifling. Victor sat at the head of the glass table, his expression unreadable. Raymond Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking down at his notepad as if he wanted to disappear from the room. After a brief introduction, Victor stood. He thanked Raymond for his service, paused, and looked around the room with a practiced smile. He announced that the board had decided to appoint Sabrina Halloway as our new chief technology officer. The words hung in the air, cold and shocking. Sabrina was Victor's 25-year-old niece. She had joined Vanguard only 4 months prior, working as a junior project coordinator under Victor's direct supervision. She had no technical background, no engineering degree, and absolutely no understanding of our core infrastructure. She sat just 4 chairs away from me, blinking in feigned surprise before standing to accept the applause. She looked like an actress accepting an award she had known she was going to win all along. Victor placed a proud hand on her shoulder, declaring that Sabrina brought a fresh, modern perspective to our technology department. The room filled with polite, hesitant clapping, and I joined in reflexively. My hands moved, but my mind was completely numb. It felt as if I had been struck in the chest, yet I was forced to maintain a pleasant smile. I sat at my desk for the rest of that afternoon, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I stared at a blank document. The office around me was filled with the usual sounds: the hum of the air conditioner, the clicking of keyboards, and the quiet chatter of coworkers. But to me the noise felt incredibly distant, as if I were underwater. A wave of profound silence had washed over my mind. For 7 years, I had built the technical foundation of Vanguard Infrastructure Partners. I had written the core database failover protocols, designed the security architecture, and personally saved our largest clients from disastrous outages. All of that dedication had been erased in a single moment, replaced by the simple fact of family lineage. I knew I could not stay, but I also knew I could not simply pack my things and walk away in defeat. I needed to analyze my situation logically, the same way I analyzed a failing system. I opened my personal employment contract, which I had kept in a secure folder, and began to read through the dense legal language. I had negotiated a specific rider when I was hired 7 years ago, a document that Victor Halloway had likely overlooked. At the time, I had insisted on retaining the copyright to a proprietary database clustering library that I had written before joining Vanguard. The rider stated that Vanguard had a non-exclusive license to use my proprietary library, but that the license would immediately terminate if I left the company, unless Vanguard paid a one-time licensing renewal fee of $150,000 within 30 days of my departure. Without that specific library, Vanguard's core system architecture would lose its ability to handle automated failovers, leaving their entire client network vulnerable to catastrophic data corruption. Furthermore, I recalled that Victor Halloway, as the chief executive officer of a publicly traded firm, owed a strict fiduciary duty of care and loyalty to the company's shareholders. Appointing an unqualified relative with only 4 months of administrative experience to the position of chief technology officer was a clear breach of that duty, especially since Sabrina had no engineering qualifications whatsoever. If the board of directors and the major shareholders discovered that the company's entire technical infrastructure was at risk due to a nepotistic appointment, the legal and financial fallout for Victor would be immense. I spent 3 hours that evening drafting my resignation letter. I did not write it with anger or resentment. Instead, I kept the tone cold, professional, and precise. I detailed my 7 years of service, listed the major projects I had led, and explicitly stated that I was resigning because I no longer believed that technical competence or professional merit was valued within the organization. I added a single quiet warning at the end of the letter. I would be departing in exactly 2 weeks, and I would ensure that my proprietary software library was deactivated in accordance with the terms of our original contract if the licensing renewal fee was not paid. I hit the send button at exactly 4:58 on Friday afternoon, copying Victor Halloway, Raymond Caldwell, and our Director of Human Resources. Over the weekend, I did not think about Vanguard. I turned off my work phone, left my laptop closed in its bag, and spent the entire time with Lydia. We walked through the quiet trails of the Pacific Northwest, looking at the tall pine trees and listening to the rushing water of the local rivers. For the first time in years, my mind was not constantly scanning for system alerts or worrying about server performance. When I looked at Lydia, I realized how much of her childhood I had traded away for a company that had ultimately discarded me without a second thought. That realization did not make me angry. It made me resolved. I knew that my next steps had to be guided by a strict commitment to my own self-respect. On Monday morning, I walked into the office at my usual time. I did not mention my resignation to my team, nor did I make any dramatic statements. I simply sat at my desk and began to prepare my transition documentation. I wanted my departure to be handled with the same precision and professionalism that I had brought to the company for the last 7 years. I knew that the silence I was maintaining was far more powerful than any loud protest, and I could feel the tension in the office building starting to rise as the news of my departure slowly leaked out. To ensure that the transition was documented legally and thoroughly, I compiled a detailed repository index of all systems I had authored. I was careful to separate my personal property from Vanguard's systems. The proprietary failover clustering database, which I had developed independently prior to my tenure, and which remained my sole intellectual property under the signed contract rider, was marked with explicit notice. I created a clean, comprehensive overview of the system dependencies, detailing how the primary load balancers routed traffic through my clustering engine. I did not sabotage anything. In fact, I did the opposite. I made sure that if the company chose to comply with the legal contract and pay the agreed-upon fee, the systems would continue to run smoothly. I was giving them a fair, clear choice. If they wanted my work, they would have to pay for it, just as they would pay any other vendor. If they refused, they would have to find a way to rebuild 7 years of architectural development from scratch in less than 30 days. I knew that Victor Halloway was used to bullying employees into submission, but he had never faced an engineer who understood the law and the system architecture as thoroughly as I did. This was my quiet strategy, and I was prepared to see it through to the very end. On Tuesday morning, Victor Halloway's executive assistant called me to request my presence in the chief executive officer's office. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked up the carpeted stairs to the top floor. The office was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the gray Seattle skyline. Victor was standing by the window, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. My printed resignation letter lay on his desk, covered in blue ink notations. When I entered, Victor did not turn around immediately. He let the silence stretch between us for a long moment, a classic corporate power play designed to make me feel uncomfortable. When he finally turned, his face was tight with anger, his usual polished charm replaced by a cold, aggressive stare. He asked me what I thought I was doing, pointing at the paper on his desk. I sat down in the leather chair across from him, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression calm. I told him that my letter was self-explanatory and that I was giving my 2 weeks' notice. Victor stepped closer, leaning over his desk, and told me that I was being incredibly short-sighted. He claimed that Sabrina's appointment was a strategic decision to modernize the company's leadership, and that my refusal to support her was a sign of professional immaturity. He then threatened me, stating that if I attempted to contact any of Vanguard's clients or badmouth the company to our competitors, he would enforce the non-compete clause in my contract and sue me for everything I owned. I looked Victor directly in the eyes and smiled faintly. I had spent the previous evening preparing for this exact argument. I explained to him that under Washington state law, specifically Revised Code of Washington Section 49.62, non-compete agreements are legally void and unenforceable unless the employee's earnings exceed a specific statutory threshold, or if the employer agrees to pay the employee's base salary during the period of restriction. Furthermore, I pointed out that Vanguard's attempt to enforce a non-compete against a departing employee who was resigning due to a material breach of promise would not stand up in court. I then raised the issue of my proprietary database clustering library. I reminded him that under federal copyright law, specifically Title 17 of the United States Code, I retained full ownership of that code, and that Vanguard's license to use it would terminate exactly 30 days after my departure, unless the $150,000 renewal fee was paid in full. I explained that if they attempted to bypass the license validation checks or modify my code to keep the systems running without payment, they would be committing willful copyright infringement, which carried statutory damages of up to $150,000 per infringement. Victor's face went pale, his hand tightening around his coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. He tried to argue that the company had paid for my time and therefore owned the code, but I calmly reminded him of the signed contract rider, which was currently sitting in the Human Resources Archive. I also mentioned that as a major shareholder, he had a fiduciary duty to protect the company from avoidable litigation and system failures. If the board of directors learned that he had placed the company's entire technical infrastructure at risk to protect his niece's unearned appointment, they would likely vote to remove him from his position. Victor was silent, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to maintain his composure. He realized that I had structured my departure with absolute legal precision, leaving him with no viable options for retaliation. I stood up, thanked him for his time, and walked out of the office, leaving him standing alone by the window. For the rest of my 2 weeks, I worked diligently on the handover documentation. I documented every system, every server configuration, and every administrative password, but I sent the final files only to Raymond Caldwell. I knew that Sabrina would never be able to understand the complexity of the architecture I had built, and I wanted to ensure that my hands were completely clean when the inevitable collapse occurred. During my remaining days at the office, the atmosphere became increasingly strained. Sabrina began holding daily alignment meetings, attempting to assert her authority over the engineering team. She would speak at length about cloud scalability and microservices, using buzzwords she had gathered from technology blogs. But whenever a senior engineer asked a specific question about our load balancing algorithms or database replication lag, she would quickly deflect the question to her assistant or promise to follow up later. The engineers would look at me, their eyes filled with frustration and silent appeals for help, but I remained silent. I was no longer their leader. I was a departing consultant completing my high contract. I watched as the team's morale began to deteriorate, replaced by a growing sense of anxiety. They knew as well as I did that a complex infrastructure cannot be managed by enthusiasm and nepotism. It requires deep technical knowledge and years of hands-on troubleshooting experience. By refusing to engage in their corporate games, I was protecting myself and letting the natural consequences of Victor's decisions play out. I cleared out my desk quietly on my final Friday, packing my personal notebooks and leaving my corporate laptop on the empty desk. I shook hands with Raymond Caldwell, who gave me a tight, knowing nod, and walked out of the building into the cool afternoon. Immediately after my final day at Vanguard Infrastructure Partners, I established my own consulting firm, Ridgeline Tech Architecture. I rented a small office space, set up a professional website, and reached out to the key clients I had spent 7 years supporting. These were not corporate entities to me. They were people who trusted my expertise. I contacted Judith Vance, the operations director at Sentinel Healthcare Systems, Douglas Thorne, the vice president of technology at Aegis Global Networks, and Andrew Mercer, the director of the Columbia Basin Public Works. I did not ask them to leave Vanguard. I simply informed them that I had started my own firm and was available for consulting work. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Judith Vance told me that since my departure, Sentinel Healthcare had experienced 3 system outages, and Sabrina Halloway had been unable to explain the cause. She said they were already preparing to terminate their agreement with Vanguard and wanted to sign a retainer contract with Ridgeline Tech Architecture for $85,000. Douglas Thorne and Andrew Mercer expressed similar frustrations, stating that Vanguard's technical support had become completely unresponsive. Within a month, Ridgeline had secured contracts with 3 of Vanguard's largest former clients, providing us with a solid financial foundation. Meanwhile, things at Vanguard were deteriorating rapidly. Without my proprietary database clustering library, their systems began to experience frequent synchronization errors. Rather than paying the licensing fee, Victor Halloway apparently ordered Sabrina to find a way to bypass the software license validation. Sabrina and her junior assistant attempted to log into my personal server to retrieve the original source code, using an old administrative account that they had failed to deactivate. However, I had set up automated security alerts on my network. When I received notification of the unauthorized access attempt, I immediately contacted my attorney, who drafted a formal letter citing California Penal Code, Section 502, which governs unauthorized access to computers and computer systems, as well as federal copyright laws. We sent the cease and desist letter directly to Vanguard's board of directors, detailing the exact IP addresses and user credentials used during the hacking attempt. The board was horrified to discover that the chief executive officer and the new chief technology officer were engaging in potentially criminal conduct to cover up their technical failures. The legal pressure on Vanguard intensified. The board initiated an independent internal investigation, hiring an outside law firm to audit the technology department's operations. The audit revealed that Sabrina had no understanding of the systems she was supposed to manage, and that her attempts to modify my proprietary code had resulted in severe data corruption across several client databases. Sentinel Healthcare Systems officially filed a lawsuit against Vanguard for breach of contract, citing the prolonged outages and the lack of qualified technical personnel. I watched these developments from a distance, focusing my energy on delivering exceptional service to my new clients at Ridgeline. I hired a brilliant young systems engineer named Zachary Miller to help me manage the workload. Zachary was hardworking, eager to learn, and possessed a deep respect for technical excellence. Together, we rebuilt the cloud infrastructures for our clients, creating systems that were far more stable and efficient than the ones they had left behind at Vanguard. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction knowing that my success was built entirely on my own capabilities and the trust I had earned over the years. To secure our clients' systems, Zachary and I spent long nights designing a completely new, modern database architecture that did not rely on any legacy Vanguard systems. We migrated Sentinel Healthcare's patient records to a secure, distributed cloud database, reducing their query times by 40% and eliminating the database lag that had caused their previous outages. Judith Vance was so impressed with our work that she introduced us to the directors of 2 other major regional networks, both of whom were currently looking for a reliable technology partner. I realized that by focusing on quality and integrity, we were naturally attracting the clients who valued real capability over corporate bureaucracy. My small office was constantly busy, filled with the hum of servers and the quiet murmurs of planning sessions. For the first time in my career, I was not merely managing crises, I was preventing them. I was building a company that reflected my values, and I knew that this was the most effective response to the injustice I had experienced at Vanguard. Douglas Thorne from Aegis Global Networks visited our office a few weeks later. He sat down and reviewed our proposed cloud migration strategy. Douglas was an experienced technology director who had worked in the sector for over 25 years. He looked at our diagrams and admitted that Vanguard had never offered them this level of customization or transparency. He explained that since I left, the communication from Vanguard had been abysmal, and that Sabrina had tried to convince him that a major database sync error was actually a routine maintenance event. He shook my hand and told me that Aegis Global was officially ending their relationship with Vanguard. Hearing those words from a respected colleague confirmed what I had suspected. Clients do not stay with a corporate brand out of blind loyalty. They stay because of the trust they have in the individuals who keep their operations running. This realization gave Zachary and me the confidence to expand our infrastructure further, knowing that our foundation was solid. 6 months after my departure from Vanguard, the final collapse arrived. The company's board of directors officially suspended Victor Halloway from his position as chief executive officer, citing a breach of fiduciary duty and the mismanagement of company assets. Sabrina Halloway resigned shortly afterward, realizing that she could not survive the legal scrutiny of the internal audit. Raymond Caldwell, who had been brought out of retirement temporarily to stabilize the company, called me on a Friday afternoon. He asked if I would be willing to meet him for lunch to discuss a potential return to the firm. We met at a quiet restaurant in downtown Seattle, and Raymond offered me the position of vice president of engineering, with a salary of $250,000 and full authority to restructure the technology department. I looked at Raymond, a man I still respected, and shook my head. I told him that I had spent 7 years building a system that was discarded for nepotism, and that I had finally realized that my value did not depend on a corporate title. I told him that Ridgeline Tech architecture was thriving, and that I had no desire to return to a company that only valued competence when they were on the verge of ruin. Raymond smiled sadly, admitting that he had expected my answer and that he did not blame me for my choice. Before we parted, Raymond handed me an envelope containing copies of internal emails between Victor and Sabrina, which had been uncovered during the audit. The emails clearly showed that Victor had planned to use Sabrina to push me out of the company while stealing my proprietary code to avoid paying the licensing fee. These documents provided me with absolute protection against any future legal claims from Vanguard, proving that their losses were entirely the result of their own misconduct and incompetence. A few weeks later, I ran into Sabrina at a technology conference in Portland. She looked tired, the arrogance she had displayed in the boardroom completely gone. She approached me and apologized for her role in Victor's scheme, admitting that she had been out of her depth from the very beginning. I accepted her apology, realizing that she had simply been a tool in Victor's desperate attempt to maintain control of the company. I felt no anger toward her, only a quiet sense of closure. Today, Ridgeline Tech Architecture is a highly respected firm in the Pacific Northwest. We have a team of 6 dedicated professionals, and our client list continues to grow through word of mouth. I no longer work 80 hours a week, and I never miss a dinner with Lydia. We spend our weekends hiking, talking about her plans for college, and enjoying the quiet beauty of the mountains. I learned that the deepest kind of revenge is not a loud conflict or a public triumph. It is the act of walking away from a toxic environment and building a life of integrity, competence, and self-respect. If you are currently feeling undervalued or overlooked in your career, remember that your skills belong to you, not to the company that employs you. You have the power to write your own next chapter, and the quiet strength of your own competence is something that no corporate executive can ever take away from you. The real victory is not winning a title. It is reclaiming your own worth and living your life on your own terms. As the sun sets over the Puget Sound, casting a warm orange glow across the water, I sit on my deck with a feeling of deep peace. I know that the road I chose was not the easiest, but it was the only one that allowed me to keep my dignity intact. The collapse of Vanguard was not my doing. It was the inevitable result of leadership that valued personal connections over real ability. By standing firm on my legal rights and relying on my technical expertise, I built a foundation that no corporate executive could shake. I am no longer a cog in a machine that does not care about my sacrifices. I am the architect of my own future, and that is a victory that no corporate title could ever match. I watch Lydia laugh as she describes her high school classes, and I know with absolute certainty that I made the right decision. My career is no longer a source of stress and missed moments. It is a testament to the power of competence and the enduring value of self-respect. Reflecting on this journey, I realized that the most difficult part was the initial decision to step into the unknown. When you have spent years in a comfortable, predictable role, the prospect of starting over can be terrifying. But when you are forced to choose between comfort and self-respect, the only real choice is to choose yourself. Zachary and I often discuss this in our weekly meetings, reminding ourselves that we are building more than just systems. We are building a reputation for reliability. Our clients know that when they hire Ridgeline, they are hiring a team that takes pride in its work and stands behind every line of code. We do not have a massive marketing department or a polished public relations team, but we have something far more valuable: the trust of the people we serve. That trust is the true cornerstone of our success, and it is something that Victor Halloway could never replicate with all the corporate power at his disposal. I look forward to the challenges of the future, knowing that whatever comes next, we are ready to handle it with the same calm and precision that brought us here.